Welcome to the Talking with the School of Transportation podcast with your hosts, Ian Campbell and Harnek Gill. Let's get into it now. Welcome to the Talkin with the School of Transportation podcast. I'm Ian Campbell, one of your hosts, and I'm here with Harnek Gill, the other host. How's it going today?
Great. Hello, everybody, and thanks for listening in. We're very excited. This is our first podcast.
Well, we hope you listen.
We're hoping they're listening.
Yeah, listeners would be lovely.
Yeah. So we're going to focus on talking about ourselves a little bit and getting an idea of maybe what you guys want to hear in future podcasts.
Yeah, it's going to be the intro to what this might become.
This is the intro to the intro.
The intro to the intro is a fun way to put it, yes. So the School of Transportation, we are both professors here for Centennial College. We are automotive service technicians as our background, and we now teach here. And what we're trying to do is bring another way for some difficult topics to be brought up. You know, like what you teach SSB mainly. What is one of the hardest topics that you have to teach?
I find that one of the things the students struggle the most with is understanding diagnostics in relation to ABS, for example. If we want to go over the specifics of how certain sensor types work and how certain systems work, they have some trouble with that. There's a learning curve, and I think diagnostics as a whole, if you understand an approach, you can apply it to almost anything. You have a sort of approach that you would follow with, but with individuals who are still new to the trade or only a couple years in, they haven't really built that plan or that attack plan for diagnostics. So I find that that's something that there's a little bit of confusion with, and there's times where we've drawn things out on the board and gone over it, and it might stick for a little bit and then it gets a little muddled again. It's just one of those things you need practice with, right?
But I love what you said, attack plan, because I say you got to figure out your diagnostic process, and everybody's could be different. There's no right or wrong way to diagnose something. And I think that's been a challenge for some students. They're like, oh, I didn't do it your way. Well, it's not my way. In the lab, I might ask you to do it my way because it makes sense to me, but you need to find that diagnostic process. So in the school, it's kind of difficult to like push that because we have to have certain props or console lab units and whatnot that we can use a certain way. But in the field or in the industry, you have to find your way. How do you read that diagram? How do you walk through that? So attack plan and diagnostic process and that stuff, that's going to be a hard podcast to talk about. But
yeah, that might be a long one as well because there's so much there.
Yeah, I think that would be fun.
So what do you think in terms of, I'd say your experience in teaching drivetrains is probably one of your favorite subjects to teach.
Yeah, my favorite subject for sure.
So what do students have trouble with there?
A couple things. One would be differential, the wear patterns and whatnot. And if you've been at Centennial, especially on the 930 Warden building, you'll know Mr. Nalepka, and I'm going to beg him to get on here because that guy's brilliant when it comes to some of that stuff. But beyond that, planetary gears is another one where it's kind of a challenge to see, how do they work? What do they do? There's different ways to learn it. There's a whole bunch of acronyms that I'm not a huge fan of, but some students love. And if you've had Mr. Mantis, you definitely know some of those acronyms, but they do help. So, maybe we'll have Mr. Mantis on talking about planetary gears and other things. But yes.
And that's the thing, right? Different approaches for different students is there's some things that work with some students and some things that just don't. It just depends on the individual.
100%. And that's what I think this podcast could be great for, because if we're just chatting about some of these subjects that you may or may not get or understand well, maybe it's another avenue for you to learn from. So, if we're talking about that diagnostic process or that plan of attack for one specific circuit or a diagram, how would you walk through this challenge? I think that could be really good, whether you're just driving home in the car, listening to this, or your professor assigns this as some homework because maybe we'll do something good.
Yeah. So you know what? Actually, I got to switch it up a little bit. What is something you'd like to learn more about yourself in terms of the automotive field?
So that's easy for me. It's EV. I know very little about EV, and I've kind of done that on purpose since I started here at the college. I went right into the teaching side of things and not so much the car side. So I did my Tilly and teaching and learning in higher education and teaching adults kind of thing. So I learned how to try and do another part of my career. And I really want to get back into some more automotive because I do miss it, you know, and EVs and the technology that's coming, hydrogen, just the new fuel sources and stuff kind of interested me a little bit. And mainly because students ask so much about them. You know, I don't have the knowledge that I wish I did when they asked. Now, I haven't taught those subjects, so that's another factor. But yeah, I'd love to have, actually, Mike Lomnicki does an EV course, and maybe we'll have him on and he can chat about some of that stuff.
That would be great.
Yeah, that would be a really good episode. So, yeah. What about you? Any more thoughts?
Yeah, you know what? It's probably the same for me, EV as well. But I will say in... just I guess a little bit of a background about my experiences. I started at a private shop and then quickly got into a Chrysler dealer, and I've worked with Chrysler for about 13 or 14 years now. And as many of our listeners will know, Chrysler will put a Hemi in almost anything that they can fit in, right? So we
put the SRT on it as well.
Yeah, SRT, right? So for a long time, they weren't very focused on what they're now calling LEVs, low emission vehicles. There's so many acronyms. This is one of those other things. There's just so many.
LEV,
PZEVs and all sorts of stuff. So BEVs and just all sorts of stuff. So they've, in recent years, with demand, have shifted a little bit more to EV, and I am starting to work a little bit on more with those EVs and partially hybrid or partially zero emissions vehicles, whatever you want to call them. But yeah, there's still a lot to go, and I look at it in comparison to a technician who's maybe worked at Toyota. They've been using hybrids for almost 15 years, it seems like, right? So yeah, I'm working on expanding my knowledge with hybrid vehicles and electrical vehicles.
And those big batteries, right?
Yeah. And you know what? It is they're talking to apprentices that at the dealership and students here at the college. The worry is always you're going to get zapped, right? There's a lot of safeguards, and if you're careful, you'll be okay. But it's no different than working on anything on a hoist and lifting something. There's always a risk if you don't follow proper safety, right?
I think that's a good point too, and not just EVs, but with the trade in general, it can be dangerous as a whole. Like there's lots of chemicals we're using, there's lots of heavy equipment we're using, and I think if you take the approach, or this approach anyway, if you respect the component you're working with and treat it the way it's supposed to be treated, you're not going to get hurt. Whether it's a hoist, whether it's a chemical, or whether it's electricity. You know, like if you respect that system, do the proper processes like we teach you here, you know, there's no reason to be fearful of it, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a big factor when it comes to that stuff.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? You want to be, if you're sufficiently cautious, you won't be fearful because you're worried about all you're aware of all your safeguards that need to be at play, and you can apply that to. This is what I love about this trade, the automotive trade. What we learn and what we deal with, we can apply to anything in life in general, it seems like,
100%.
right? So whether I'm doing plumbing at home or fixing my dryer that won't warm my clothes, or just dealing with anything that might be considered a little bit more dangerous, there's a certain mindset you kind of switch on as a technician or a tradesperson that will keep you safe and
awareness. Yeah, like don't use the cutting torch near a gas tank and whatnot. And we've all heard bad stories. I have a few. We'll save those for another podcast. But yeah.
So what do you think? Aside from the new technology, what have you seen that's kind of been phased out, something you don't deal with or see anymore?
Oh, you know what I pulled in my toolbox the other day? A timing light. I was like, I should keep this, but why?
Yeah.
And then I was talking to somebody recently, and they're like, oh, I had to. It was an old Civic or something. I was like, oh, I have a timing light. I could. No, it was a boat. My buddy was got his engine rebuilt for his boat, and he needed a timing light, and he was doing it by the ears, like by the sound of it, trying to move the distributor and whatnot. And I was like, oh, I can lend you my timing light. Like, please, it's been used once in my life. Like, so that kind of stuff where a computer, that used to be all mechanical. You would have to move that to be in time.
Yep.
And now it's, electronic and it shifts, and amazing technology that happens throughout that. But yeah, timing light, what's something that you have kind of seen go by the wayside almost?
Oh, that's interesting. I guess one thing is just with the working in a dealership environment, there's so much new technology all the time, and you almost forget. I saw the original DRB scan tool.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these old scan tools, they worked very different. And
I think we've talked before, you keep going on that, but before we do that, we've talked about the brick. And if you're an older technician, like I'm pushing 40 and I barely touch them, but the snap-on brick, the big red brick with the keys and all that stuff, this was pre-OBD2. That was the OG scan tool for me, and that's funny. Yeah,
I remember using that in high school.
Yeah,
okay. That's where I first had experience with that one. And then when I did work at the first private shop, we did have that as well. Yes, we did the keys. It wasn't a snap-on scan tool; it was something else. But it had all the little keys you had to switch in based off your vehicle type. And, for our younger listeners, things are a lot different today, but it also depends on what manufacturer you're with too, right?
Yeah, and good and bad, right? Because
For sure.
The old days, you didn't have much, like, how do I say this? You didn't have a fault code. You didn't have an identifier to go, hey, let's look at this part of the system. It was more, you had to figure that diagnostic process. And
yes.
And you talk to some older technicians and it's like, oh yeah, like do this because of this and whatnot. And now it's like, oh, get my scan tool in. And I had an issue on my van the other day. I was like, oh, I wish I had my scan tool here so I could just, plug it in and see what's going on. I don't have that. So now I'm like, oh, what's the old way of doing this? How do I roll out through this? And actually, you can't on some of them.
That's it. Yeah.
Like I can't even do some tests because I can't activate the module to do different things. So it's pretty interesting on how that works.
Yeah, that's the two sides of the coin, right? One side is, in a way, through having systems that are monitored by the PCM or whatever module and setting a very specific GTC, it gives you a route to follow. The other side is the systems have become so much more complex.
Exactly.
There's so much more complexity.
Yeah. And they're challenging.
Yeah.
Like a correlation code. You'd never see that in the 90s.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You'd never see a timing correlation code. Yeah. Now, it's every other day.
Yeah.
You have an OCV valve that's screwing up or something like that. So it's way more complex, the systems, and to learn them, it's super challenging. But you miss some of that like feel, that mechanic-y feel. You know what I mean? So yeah.
There was, I guess, probably a more recent or a younger term perhaps is you get a certain vibe for things.
Okay.
You'd get into a car and you'd have an idea just off how it drove what was the issue, or you'd be touching a component and you'd have an idea. I'll give you an example. I had an apprentice who had a code, I believe, like you're saying, that correlation code with a 3.6 Chrysler motor, and he changed the intake phaser. Okay, so what the phaser allows you to do is it will actually change position. So you're changing your timing essentially.
Yeah.
Okay, for any listener who's not aware, and it's going to use a whole lot of data parameters for this. How much load is on the engine, cam, crank data, accelerator, all sorts of stuff. And what happened was, after he had replaced the phaser, he ended up with a different DTC, a DTC for the cam. So the concern was, as an apprentice, he's thinking, what did I screw up?
Yeah.
Right? So I was going over with it, going over the whole vehicle. He had the valve cover off, and we're looking at the camshafts. The lobes are good. Everything seems okay. And we just put a wrench on the end of the oil control valve that goes in the phaser. Mm-hmm. And the backlash felt wrong. It felt excessive.
I know
so
exactly
what you mean. I said, take the other one off, and there's no backlash at all. There's no movement of that phaser when it's at lock pin. Well, it was just a new defective part. Brand new part, defective. Right out of the box, from the dealership, this stuff happens, right? And it throws you for a loop, right? So he had the old one handy. We put that on, and that DTC went away. So he's ordered another one.
Oh, good.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the toughest things as well, is when you go, you do your diag, you do everything like you're supposed to, and then they give you a bad part.
Yeah.
Or something goes a little sideways. And
Especially as an apprentice.
Absolutely.
Because you got the confidence, like, man, I did this, fired up, and then the engine light pops back on. You're like, what? Like, I'm better than I know what I'm doing. And confidence is so important for this trade. Like, calling some of these parts, they can be thousands of dollars, and you're like I know I've done my diligence. This is the wrong part. And when something like that happens, I remember being a young apprentice. And I'd have to start all the cars for the guys. They do like this big timing belt job or whatever, and they're like, "Here, you fire it up. I don't want to see it if it's bad." And I was like, "Really?" And they're like, he was a good tech, but just didn't have that much confidence and whatnot. So we'd be like, "Can you fire that up? I'm going to go get a coffee, and if it blows up, I'm just going to take my toolbox out of the shop and whatever." But having that confidence is huge, and I learned that as I went along, like being confident in your work, knowing your timing marks are lined up properly, knowing the job you did, knowing that oil drain bolt is in properly and torqued properly is super important. The O-ring on the oil filter that you put on, make sure it's not torn and leaking all over. And that's the apprentice, thing right now is to make sure oil's not spilling out after an oil change is done.
Oh boy, is it ever? Yeah, I see it happen all the time, and I find for myself the way that I'm confident is almost everything I've done I've triple checked. Just in the moment, I find, like, for example, we're talking about the oil spilling after an oil change. We find this a lot as Chrysler guys on that 3.6 liter motor, where the individual doing the oil change doesn't put the O-ring in the correct groove.
Yep.
So I've seen this happen so many times with apprentices that I've basically got it down to a science exactly what's happened. Yeah. There's two larger grooves, and they're not in the lowest one, so they're in the wrong groove, and it's actually gets chewed up by the threads, right?
Yeah. And so you can actually see it on the O-ring where it gets cut from the threads. Yeah.
And for me personally, what my process is, I have the cap in my hand. I take the old one off. I put the new one on. I run my finger around it fully so I know it's in the correct bottom groove. Then I put a little bit of oil and I go again, and I'm like, good. Like, it's a process.
I'll go one step beyond you. I get my little snap-on screwdriver and go behind it and roll it all the way around so that I know the O-ring's not twisted.
There you go.
And then I do the little oil on it and throw her in. So it's that routine and that process that we talked about earlier, whether it's diagnostic or even repair process, on how important it needs to be. So I have a story that I'll save for the end because it revolves around that as well. So I have a question for the listeners, and we'll see if we get any emails about this. But what do you want to listen? What do you want to hear? What topics would you like to hear? Like we've talked about a few things that we think are important, and we'll talk about those and continue to do more and more topics. But if you have a specific topic that you want us to talk about, or bring an expert in to talk about, send us an email. My email is icampbell, so ICAMPBELL @centennialcollege.ca. And feel free to send me an email with, just say, hey, Talking with School of Transportation podcast or Talking with S.O.T. I'd love to hear this. So if you guys have any of that, please do so. We would love that.
Yeah, whether it is on something like how evap systems work, whether it's something specific to certain types of AC systems and diagnostics, whether it's certain things about the industry as a whole, right? It doesn't have to be specifically a vehicle system.
Yeah.
And even if it's something about maybe what's Mr. Campbell's background,
Sure.
What has he worked in, what manufacturers did he like working with, or whatever you're interested in hearing about, or
even learning.
We want to hear, yeah,
or even
absolutely.
even just how do you learn about how do you take a test? What questions do you need? You guys have a C of Q. We do a C of Q prep course here, and like maybe we have a podcast about the C of Q. How did you do? I did terrible on mine. I just barely passed. I was a cocky punk, but I'll save that story for that podcast too. And another one, I'd love to have our dean Alan McClellan on and just talk about culture at Centennial College and how can you set yourself up to succeed here? Because I'll be honest, if you just put some effort in and show up to class, you got a great opportunity here. The college, the teachers, the environment sets you up to do well if you put that effort in. So I'd love to have him on and chat with him about what he thinks, a student culture should look like and a student needs to do to succeed and not just at the college, but this is a founding block for your life. Like I never thought I'd teach. This is an awesome opportunity for me from being a student here at Centennial College 20 years ago now. So yeah,
absolutely right. It's your foundation block, and this is, as we look at most of the students coming in as apprentices, they're right at the beginning of their journey, and you want to have a strong foundation and a strong start to propel you, because you can go so far in this trade, and you can choose to, really be I'd say a world-class technician that's coveted by many shops.
Yeah.
Right. Or you can move on to be something like a service manager.
Or Al Coolis.
We
could have him on too.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
right. So who is
high
he?
up in Chrysler? I don't know his title or whatnot, but he consults now for all the big dealerships and manufacturers and. On the automotive industry as a whole. And he started as a technician. So,
yeah. And that's the thing, right? There's so many routes you can take on this journey, right? And we're just at the first, as an apprentice, at the first couple steps of the journey. Yeah.
Well, I think we should wrap this up. But at the end of every episode, I'm hoping we can have a fun meme or story. All right. So I did see this the other day, and we'll try and do it justice over podcast.
Yeah.
Because, if I showed you the picture, it would make a lot of sense. But let's see if we can narrate this so it can work well. So there was this plane. A bunch of professors were invited to go on a flight, and there's this plane, and they're all on the runway. It's on the runway, sorry. And the picture is of all the professors outside the plane. And the one person was like, why is everybody outside the plane? Mm-hmm. And they're like, oh, our students built this plane. And so everybody bailed out and ran on the tarmac, and they're like, we're not going to go in this thing. Yet there was one professor that said, no, I'm going to stick in my seat. I'll be okay. So they went up to him and were like, well, everybody else is afraid. Are you not afraid? He goes, no, my students built this. It'll never fly. And I laughed at that. But let's be honest, Centennial students, it would fly.
There's at least a 50-50 shot.
No, I think it is. We got some solid students, but that's funny. That goes to that apprenticeship and confidence building and all that stuff too, right? As a student and as an apprentice, you need to have that confidence. And I would jump on that flight. I like to fly and live dangerously.
You got life insurance.
I do, yes.
Yeah.
And on that note, if you can like and subscribe, that would be great. I don't know what that looks like yet. If it's on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, leave a review. You never know what'll happen. So also, please send that email, icampbell@centennialcollege.ca, if you have any topics you want to know. And until next time, we're going to have to figure out a tagline here, Harnek.
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas?
Signing off.
No,
no good.
Maybe a student can help us with a tagline.
Oh, that would be
too.
Perfect. Yeah.
So if you got a good final send off, let us know what you think. All right. Until next time, I'm Ewan Campbell.
I'm Harnek Gill.
And we'll see you next time.
Have a good one, folks.